It looks like just another artifact, an ancient list of rulers. But the Sumerian King List doesn't just record kings. It challenges everything we think we know about time. Hi, it's me. Number 5. Some kings supposedly ruled for thousands of years. The longest uninterrupted reign in human history is that of Pharaoh Khufu, 23 years. Even longer than that was the rule of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka the Great, 30 years. But put them both to shame is the Sumerian king Era, who supposedly ruled for 68 years. That's not even counting his predecessor, Alulim, whose reign lasted a whopping 28,000 years. And that brings us to the biggest head-scratcher about the Sumerian King List, its lack of explanation. The Sumerians lived in Mesopotamia between roughly 4500 and 1900 BC. So what exactly were they doing keeping track of kings from some mythical past? You may have heard of Gilgamesh, a legendary Sumerian king said to have lived in the 27th century BC and to have reigned for 48 years. In art, he was usually depicted as half man, half bull. However, he isn't mentioned on the Kish King List, though there are plenty of other names that sound made up. Some researchers believe the Sumerians were trying to record real events, but many others think it's a mix of reality and myth, though they don't explain why. This is all the more confusing because later Mesopotamian lists of kings, such as those kept by the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, do include explanations for how their kings were related, their accomplishments, and often their misadventures. For example, one list explains that after a king was defeated in war, he escaped and hid in a field, too afraid to return home. Another says that a rival killed the king and then paraded his body through the streets on a chariot. These stories may seem salacious, but they help us sort through this supposed lineage of kings. And so, without any notes at all, the Sumerian King List is incredibly hard to interpret. What we really need is some context. How did the Sumerians come up with this list? Why did they write it down? And what does it all mean? Number 4. It blends myth with history without explanation. While the Sumerian King List doesn't explain itself, it does provide some clues about the relationship between the mythical and the real. If the kings at the beginning of the list are gods, why does it end with a mortal king? And if it's a completely mythical list, why are there so many place names that have been found throughout the region? For example, the biblical city of Eden appears several times on the list, as well as Kish, which archaeologists have found evidence of in Iraq. There's also Uruk, widely believed to be the real-world inspiration for the biblical city of Erech. Then there's the Great Flood. This wasn't the first time the story appeared in writing. The Atrahasis epic tells how the gods created humans and then regretted it. To punish mankind, they sent a great flood to wipe out the entire population. But one person, Utnapishtim, was warned of the coming disaster and built a boat to survive. He and his family and animals entered the vessel, and when the waters receded, he sacrificed and was rewarded with immortality. Like the story of Noah's Ark, the story of Utnapishtim is a creation myth and a cautionary tale. We have no way of knowing how much of this story reflects actual Sumerian beliefs, though scholars estimate that the oldest written version dates back to around 1800 BC. But long before that, sometime during the early Bronze Age, the Sumerians kept writing down the names of kings who reigned for thousands of years. But they didn't explain that these were myths. They simply wove them into history. And that raises some questions. If they knew the difference between myths and reality, why wouldn't they make it clear? If they weren't recording history, why did they keep track of kings at all? And why did they bother listing places that had yet to be built or were no longer inhabited? No. 3. It mentions a great flood long before the Bible. While most religious scholars agree that the biblical story of Noah's Ark came from an older Mesopotamian myth, there's a lot of debate over exactly which myth inspired the biblical story and how similar it really is. It could have been the story of Utnapishtim that was recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, But it could have also been the story of Adapa, who was warned of an impending flood but failed to warn his people and was punished by being drowned. What makes the Sumerian King List especially intriguing is that it seems to mention the flood too. After Adapa's death, Ziusudra is said to have taken over, and according to Sargon of Akkad, he was the last king of the first dynasty of Kish. That would place him at the very end of the Sumerian King List. Many scholars argue that Ziusudra is none other than Utnapishtim, which means he survived the flood that destroyed the rest of the Sumerian royal line. But there's absolutely no way of knowing for sure. The only reason we think the list has anything to do with a flood at all is because of outside sources. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Atrahasis, and the Babylonian Genesis all tell basically the same story, the story of a great flood sent by the gods to punish sinful humanity. But none of them include any mention of a list. It's only extrapolating from the biblical story that scholars think the Sumerian King List mentions the same event. In fact, the Sumerian King List predates the story of Noah's Ark by centuries. So it's possible that the story came from here, not the other way around. No. 2. Several cities listed were thought to be myths until they were found. The Sumerian King List is mostly known today thanks to the British Museum, which houses 3 clay cylinders that contain the earliest versions. But there are fragments of the list housed in museums all over the world. Together, they contain a total of 18 kings, who ruled for a combined 24,560 years. And while a lot of the list is written in Sumerian cuneiform, the last few lines are in Akkadian. This makes sense since the Akkadians conquered the Sumerians around 2300 BC, and it was easier for them to write in the common language. But it also means that some of the Sumerian kings at the end of the list are actually real historical figures, such as Ishmi-Dagan and the aforementioned Sargon of Akkad. But who came before them? For a long time, nobody knew. Most of the cities listed in the Sumerian King List were thought to be entirely mythical until archaeologists began finding evidence of them in the early 1900s. Kish, the first capital of the Akkadian Empire, was once thought to be nothing more than a figment of someone's imagination. But excavations at the site of Warqa in Iraq uncovered artifacts from the Sumerian period, including a seal impression of a date back to 2600 BC. This is considered to be contemporary with the earliest dynasties listed in the Sumerian King List. Researchers have also found remnants of the cities of Eden and Eridu, which are mentioned repeatedly on the list. Each new discovery pushes back the timeline of Mesopotamian history and helps us better understand the region during the time the Sumerians lived there. But it still leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions. Are there cities on the list that haven't been found yet? Did the Sumerians create a list purely for the purpose of confusing future historians? And who was the first to write it down? Number 1. No one knows who first wrote it or why. The earliest version of the Sumerian King List dates back to roughly 1800 BC, but it's unknown who wrote it or why. The oldest known copy was discovered at the ancient city of Shuruppak, which is possibly the same as the biblical Shuruppak, where the hero Utnapishtim lived. It was found along with several other pieces of writing on a clay slab that also contained parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But that doesn't tell us anything about who wrote the documents. It could have been a priest copying down an even older version, or it could have been part of a school text. Nobody knows. And without knowing that, it's impossible to say how accurate any of the list is. After all, the Sumerians had no official record keepers, no way of verifying that the numbers were right or even what each name meant. These were likely oral traditions that changed every time they were repeated. The earliest clay cylinder was found at Tel El-Obeid and contains the oldest version of the epic. But it also includes line breaks and damaged sections that suggest it was heavily edited from an earlier source. All of this adds up to one big headache for historians. They have no way of knowing whether the Sumerian King List is a historical document, a myth disguised as fact, or a warning from a forgotten civilization. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more echoes of the past.